What makes a book dangerous? Not its weight, though some have weighed as much as a man. Not its age, though centuries can cling to parchment like dust in a locked room. Perhaps what unsettles us most is the idea that a book can survive not only time, but fear. That words copied in candlelight can outlast empires, inquisitions, libraries, and all the hands that tried to erase them. Across history, certain manuscripts have gathered more than readers. They have gathered warnings. They were hidden in monastery walls, sealed in private vaults, carried through war, translated in secret, and whispered about long after official records went silent. Some were condemned as heresy. Some were dismissed as superstition. Some were treated as if opening them meant crossing a threshold that could not easily be crossed back. And yet, behind the legends, there is always something more human. A scribe leaning over a desk long after midnight. A monk trying to make sense of punishment in grace. A scholar convinced that truth might live beyond the borders of accepted knowledge. These books did not appear from nowhere. They were made by people who lived in the same fragile world we do, a world shaped by hunger, devotion, ambition, loneliness, and the stubborn hope that hidden things might still be understood. This is not a story about proving curses or glorifying the forbidden. It is a journey through texts that stood at the edge of belief, where religion met imagination, where science had not yet separated itself from wonder, and where knowledge could feel like both salvation and risk. Each manuscript in this journey opens onto the same enduring mystery. Why have human beings always been drawn to pages that promise more than comfort? Maybe the answer is simple. We do not fear books because they contain darkness. We fear them because they reflect our own appetite to know what lies beyond the lamp's circle. And once that hunger is awakened, history suggests it rarely goes back to sleep. It began, as many unsettling stories do, with a room built for silence. In medieval Europe, scriptoria were places of discipline. Ink froze in winter, candles burned low. The scratching of quills marked the passing hours better than any clock. Inside those rooms, monks copied scripture, commentaries, and prayers meant to guide souls toward order. Yet from time to time, within that world of devotion, a manuscript emerged that seemed almost too large for ordinary faith. One of the most haunting examples is the Codex Gigas, sometimes called the Devil's Bible. It is not frightening because of rumor alone, though rumor has followed it for centuries. It is frightening because it exists at all. Vast, heavy, almost architectural in its scale, it feels less like a book than a monument built from skin, ink, and labor. To stand before it is to confront the ambition of a single object, a text so immense it seems to challenge the limits of one human life. Legend says it was written in a single night by a monk desperate to escape punishment, aided by forces no prayer could sanctify. Historians doubt the tale, and rightly so. The handwriting suggests long, disciplined work, perhaps years of it. But legends do not cling without reason. People sensed in the manuscript something unsettling, not proof of the supernatural, but evidence of a mind reaching beyond what seemed reasonable, even safe. The Codex contains scripture, chronicles, medical writings, penitential texts, and practical knowledge. It gathers holiness and mortality in the same breath. Then, in one unforgettable image, it presents the devil himself, not as a screaming nightmare, but as a figure held in stillness. That calm may be what makes the image endure. Evil in human imagination is often most disturbing when it is patient. And so the question arises, was the danger in the image, the legend, or the mirror it held up to the people who feared it? Sometimes a forbidden book is not dangerous because it leads us away from belief, but because it reveals how close belief has always lived to dread. What if a book could feel less like an object and more like a locked door? Few manuscripts carry that sensation as strongly as the Voynich Manuscript. Its pages are filled with writing no one has conclusively read, arranged in a script that looks deliberate, elegant, and stubbornly coherent. Beside the text drift strange botanical drawings, circular diagrams, bathing figures, and constellations that seem almost familiar, until the eye lingers and realizes nothing fully belongs to the known world. The manuscript does not announce itself as frightening. It does something subtler. It withholds. For more than a century, cryptographers, linguists, historians, and dreamers have approached it with the confidence that every code must eventually yield. Some believed it was a lost scientific treatise. Others suspected a medical text, an alchemical guide, or an elaborate deception. Each theory reveals as much about the people proposing it as about the manuscript itself. We see patterns because the human mind is built to rescue meaning from confusion. We look at silence and assume a voice is waiting inside it, and yet the Voynich Manuscript remains suspended between explanation and refusal. Modern analysis suggests it was not scribbled at random. Its structure carries the rhythm of a real system, perhaps even a real language, though no final key is held. That uncertainty is precisely what gives it power. It reminds us that not all human expression survives in a form we can recover. Some messages drift out of reach, even when the paper remains. There is something deeply moving in that. We often imagine history as a great archive waiting to be decoded, as if patience alone could restore every lost intention. But the Voynich Manuscript suggests another possibility, that the past is not simply hidden from us, but altered by distance, broken by time, and transformed by all that vanishes between one century and the next. So the mystery may not be what the manuscript says. The deeper mystery may be why we cannot bear a book that refuses to tell us who we are when we open it. It started with firelight, metal, and the old dream that matter itself might be persuaded to change. Long before chemistry became a formal science, alchemical books moved through Europe, the Middle East, and Asia like coded lanterns. They promised transformation, but rarely in plain language. Their pages shimmered with symbols, cryptic diagrams, celestial references, and recipes that seemed to belong equally to the laboratory and the soul. To modern eyes, they can look like records of failed science. To those who wrote and guarded them, they were maps of a universe still alive with hidden correspondences. Among the most whispered about were texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, along with later compilations of alchemical philosophy that blurred observation, prayer, and metaphor. These writings spoke of mercury, sulfur, salt, and the philosopher's stone, but beneath those substances lay another hunger. Alchemy was never only about gold. It was about purification, about decay reversed, about the terrible hope that what is broken might be remade into something whole. That hope made such books alluring and suspect. Religious authorities sometimes feared their ambiguity. Political rulers feared the fraud that could gather around them. Scholars distrusted the veils of allegory. Yet secrecy was not always deception. Sometimes it was protection. Knowledge that could be misunderstood, misused, or mocked often retreats into symbols. A coded page can be a shelter as much as a barrier. What survives in these manuscripts is not simply a catalog of strange experiments. It is the emotional architecture of yearning. Furnaces burned, vessels cracked, and mixtures failed. Still, the work continued because the deeper experiment was never entirely material. It asked whether nature concealed a pattern and whether the human being, in studying transformation, might also be transformed. That is why alchemical books continue to haunt the imagination. They stand at the border between error and insight, where curiosity has not yet chosen its final language. And perhaps that border still exists. Even now, when we call something impossible, are we naming a fact, or only the edge of what our time knows how to see? What happens when a book does not hide its danger in symbols, but speaks in a voice so direct that institutions begin to tremble? Some texts were feared not because they were obscure, but because they were clear. They did not arrive wrapped in riddles or protected by coded imagery. They named corruption, questioned sacred authority, or invited ordinary people to imagine a moral life outside the systems that govern them. In those moments, the written page became more than a record. It became a witness, and sometimes a quiet rebellion. Again and again, history has shown how fragile power can feel in the presence of language. A sermon copied by hand, a philosophical tract passed from friend to friend, a religious interpretation placed in the common tongue rather than the guarded language of scholars. None of these needed swords to seem threatening. They asked a simpler, more destabilizing question. Who has the right to decide what truth sounds like? That question moved through banned books like a current. Some were condemned for heresy, others for blasphemy, sedition, obscenity, or moral danger. But behind those labels was often a deeper anxiety. If people could read for themselves, think for themselves, and compare the official story to their own lived experience, then authority might no longer feel inevitable. Censorship in that light is not only an attempt to suppress ideas, it is an attempt to preserve a certain emotional order, a world in which doubt remains contained. And yet books rarely stay contained for long. They travel in pockets, in memory, in exile, in rumor. Even when burned, they leave behind a strange residue, as if prohibition itself grants them a second life. A forbidden text becomes more than text. It becomes evidence that someone, somewhere, believed these pages could alter a human being from within. Perhaps that is the quiet power at the center of every banned work. Not that it offers final answers, but that it loosens the old certainties. And once a certainty loosens, however slightly, a society must confront a difficult truth. The most enduring revolutions often begin in silence, with one person reading alone. Imagine a table scattered with remedies, star charts, animal bones, and prayers. For centuries, the boundaries between medicine, magic, and religion were not clean lines. They overlapped like shadows at dusk. In that uncertain terrain, grimoires and occult manuals became some of the most feared books in the world. Texts such as the Key of Solomon and later books of ceremonial magic were copied and recopied across generations, often in secrecy. They offered instructions for summoning spirits, crafting protective seals, invoking divine names, and bending unseen forces toward human intention. To believers, these books were dangerous because they trespassed on sacred ground. To skeptics, they were dangerous because desperation makes people vulnerable to illusion. But either way, they occupied a charged place in the imagination. What is striking is how often these books emerged in times of instability. Plague, war, poverty, and spiritual upheaval create a longing for control. When the world feels chaotic, even the most educated societies can become vulnerable to systems that promise hidden leverage over fate. A grimoire is, in one sense, a manual of power. But in another sense, it is a record of helplessness, proof that human beings will invent rituals whenever certainty disappears. Authorities often condemn such texts not only because of their contents, but because they undermined accepted channels of mediation. They suggested that an individual, alone with a page and a spoken formula, might access forces normally reserved for priests, doctors, or rulers. That possibility threatened more than doctrine. It threatened hierarchy itself. Yet the enduring fascination of these books lies in something more intimate. They reveal how thin the line can be between prayer and command, between reverence and fear, between the wish to be protected and the wish to master what cannot be mastered. We may no longer gather by candlelight to trace symbols onto parchment, but the impulse remains familiar. When uncertainty deepens, what do we reach for first? Wisdom, authority, science, ritual, memory? Perhaps the real mystery is not why people believed in dangerous books, but why the human heart still longs for instructions in moments when life offers none. There are books that disturb because they seem to speak with forbidden confidence. And then there are books that disturb because they appear to come from somewhere outside ordinary history, as though they were assembled from fragments of dream, devotion, and fever. The Book of Soiga has carried that atmosphere for centuries. Known in part through the fascination of Renaissance scholar John Dee, it became famous not simply as an occult text, but as a puzzle wrapped inside theology, angelic language, and cryptographic order. Its tables of letters, its numerical patterns, its air of hidden arrangement all suggest a mind trying to touch the architecture of the universe itself, not to observe it from a distance, but to enter it. For Dee, and for many like him, knowledge was not yet divided into the categories we now take for granted. Mathematics, astronomy, scripture, language, and spiritual inquiry moved together. A mysterious book was not merely an object of superstition. It could be a tool for decoding creation. That ambition is what makes such texts feel both noble and perilous. They reveal the beauty of human curiosity, but also its tendency to mistake longing for certainty. What frightened later generations was not only the possibility that these books concealed dangerous rituals, it was the deeper suspicion that they encouraged a person to trust private revelation over shared understanding. Once that threshold is crossed, the page becomes a mirror in which anything might appear confirmed. Meaning grows vivid, intimate, and difficult to challenge. And yet it would be too simple to dismiss these manuscripts as delusion. They belong to a real history of minds reaching toward coherence in a universe that often seems mute. Their authors were not always trying to escape reason. Sometimes they were enlarging it, searching for a language broad enough to hold both number and mystery. That tension remains with us. We still hunger for patterns, hidden systems, elegant explanations that promise to unite the scattered pieces of life. Perhaps the danger was never in the book alone. Perhaps it lives in the ancient temptation to believe that if we decode the world completely, we will no longer have to endure its uncertainty. What if the most unsettling books are not the ones that speak of demons or hidden formulas, but the ones that reopen history itself? Some manuscripts survived because they were protected. Others survived by accident, buried under dust, forgotten in caves, sealed in jars, or carried beyond the reach of empire. When they return, they do more than add information. They disturb the neatness of inherited stories. They remind us that history is not a finished monument. It is a field of fragments, and every fragment has the power to change the shape of what we thought we knew. Few discoveries embody that tension more than the Dead Sea Scrolls. Found in the desert near the middle of the 20th century, they arrived from a world already half lost to time. The landscape around them was severe and quiet, all stone, wind, and light. Yet inside those caves lay texts that spoke across centuries: biblical writings, sectarian rules, hymns, commentaries, and visions of a community trying to live faithfully under the pressure of history. The fear surrounding such texts did not come from a curse. It came from interpretation. Ancient manuscripts can deepen belief, complicate tradition, and unsettle institutions all at once. They show that sacred history was never as singular or as tidy as later generations sometimes hoped. There were debates, variations, rival expectations, and communities whose voices nearly vanished. To recover those voices is not necessarily to destroy certainty, but it does ask certainty to become more humble. That humility can feel threatening. We prefer clean lines, authorized versions, stable origins. Yet the real past is often plural. It carries revision, contradiction, and the marks of human struggle. A rediscovered manuscript does not simply tell us what people believed. It reveals how belief was lived, under occupation, in exile, in longing, in the daily labor of preserving meaning against the erosion of time. And perhaps that is why these books continue to move us. They do not merely survive history, they expose its unfinished nature. And in doing so, they leave us with a tender, difficult question. If the past is more complex than we imagine, might truth itself ask not for certainty, but for a deeper kind of listening? There is another kind of dangerous poem, quieter than prophecy and less theatrical than legend. It does not promise power over spirits or secret metals. It offers something more disruptive, a new way of seeing the human mind. In the 19th and 20th centuries, certain books unsettled the public not because they were ancient, but because they were modern. They brought forbidden subjects into daylight: desire, repression, trauma, irrational fear, the hidden logic of dreams. Works associated with early psychology, sexuality, and the inner life were often treated as corrosive, even when written in clinical language. They threatened a culture that depended on restraint, appearances, and the comforting belief that reason sat firmly at the center of the self. That is what makes these books so haunting. They suggested that beneath etiquette and doctrine, another landscape was always moving. Memory could distort, desire could contradict morality. A person could speak sincerely and still remain a mystery to themselves. This was not supernatural knowledge. It was something more intimate and, for many, more unsettling. It implied that the unfamiliar was not waiting in some distant cave or sealed archive. It was already inside us. No wonder such works were resisted. Societies often tolerate external mysteries more easily than internal ones. A cursed manuscript can be placed behind glass. A theory about the hidden motives of human behavior is harder to contain. Once language exists for what was previously unnamed, silence loses some of its power. Shame begins to loosen. So does control, and yet these books did not merely expose darkness, they also enlarged compassion. To speak openly about grief, obsession, memory, fear, or longing is to make room for human complexity. It is to admit that dignity does not require simplicity. We are not made smaller by what we conceal from ourselves. We are made more fragile and often more alone. Perhaps that is why books of the inner life were once called dangerous. They did not accuse the reader, they recognized them. And sometimes recognition, arriving in the right sentence at the right moment, can alter a life more deeply than any ancient curse ever could. Some books were feared because they seemed to distort the boundary between fact and imagination. Others were feared because they described the world too accurately. In every age, there are texts that force a society to look at itself without ornament. They may be novels, testimonies, essays, prison writings, or works of reportage. What unites them is not genre, but pressure. They capture the gap between public virtue and private cruelty, between the myths a culture tells and the lives lived underneath those myths. That kind of clarity has often been treated as a threat. So now, the danger of such books lies in their refusal to flatter. They do not always offer villains in the old dramatic sense. More often, they reveal systems, habits, and ordinary accommodations. They show how injustice survives not only through grand decisions, but through routine silence. A reader enters expecting information and leaves with a more troubling burden: recognition. The page has not invented a new darkness. It has named one that was already present. This is why so many truthful books have been censored, mocked, or pushed to the margins. Not because they are false, but because they create witnesses. Once a private suffering is described with precision, it becomes harder to pretend it does not exist. Once language is given to exploitation, exile, humiliation, or erasure, denial becomes more fragile. A society can survive many things more easily than it can survive being accurately described at the wrong moment. And yet there is mercy in these books as well. Their purpose is not simply exposure, it is restoration. To tell the truth about a wounded time is to return dignity to those who were expected to disappear inside it. The book becomes a form of memory, and memory, when honestly kept, resists the convenience of forgetting. Perhaps this is one reason dangerous books endure. They do not only ask what happened, they ask what kind of people we become when we turn away. And that question lingers long after the cover is closed, like a light left burning in a room we thought had gone dark. What if the books most feared by society are the ones that teach people to imagine a different life? Some of the most challenged works in modern history were not occult texts or ancient enigmas. They were stories. Novels placed in classrooms, memoirs passed between friends, poems that spoke too plainly about race, desire, class, exile, grief, or the quiet humiliations of everyday life. Their danger was not in hidden codes, it was in emotional access. They allowed readers to inhabit minds unlike their own, and that act, simple as it seems, has always carried consequences. Power often survives by narrowing sympathy. It prefers labels to persons, categories to voices, distance to intimacy. A story interrupts that arrangement. It slows us down. It asks us to remain with a life we might otherwise dismiss, misunderstand, or never encounter at all. When a reader begins to feel with someone who has been excluded, condemned, or forgotten, the moral landscape shifts. Not all at once, perhaps, but enough. That shift can be deeply unsettling. A book that expands empathy also expands accountability. It becomes harder to accept cruelty as normal when one has stepped, however briefly, into the texture of another person's fear or hope. This is why fiction has so often been accused of corrupting the young, weakening discipline, or undermining tradition. What it often undermines is indifference. And yet imaginative literature does more than challenge the social order. It shelters the inward life. It gives language to private confusion, especially in people who have not yet found their place in the world. For many readers, a novel or memoir is the first time they discover that their loneliness is not unique, that their unease has a history, that someone else has already crossed the emotional landscape they thought they were walking alone. So perhaps the real power of these books lies in their quiet rearrangement of the heart. They do not command, they accompany, and in that companionship, they create a subtle kind of freedom. The freedom to question inherited certainty, to widen one's circle of care, and to imagine that being fully human may begin with the courage to see another life as real as our own. There is a final category of dangerous books, and it may be the most unsettling of all. Books that survive their own world. Libraries burn, kingdoms fall, languages fracture. The hands that once turned certain pages become dust, and still a manuscript remains, waiting in some archive box, monastery shelf, museum vault, or private collection. When we speak of forbidden books, we often imagine the moment of suppression. But survival is its own kind of mystery. Why did this text remain when so many others vanished? Who risked enough to keep it alive? Every preserved manuscript carries traces of invisible guardians. A copyist who chose not to destroy it, a collector who hid it, a scholar who cataloged it instead of dismissing it. Even a conqueror who seized it rather than burned it became unwillingly part of its afterlife. The history of dangerous books is never only a history of fear. It is also a history of care, of individuals deciding that something difficult, troubling, or misunderstood still deserved to endure. That endurance changes the meaning of the book itself. What may once have been treated as corrupting, heretical, irrational, or offensive can become, over time, a witness to the very age that condemned it. The threat shifts, no longer a danger to the social order. The book becomes a danger to forgetfulness. It reminds later generations that certainty has always had a sensorial side, that institutions often confuse control with truth, and that what one era buries, another may need in order to understand itself. There is something humbling in that reversal. We inherit not only wisdom, but rescued uncertainty. The past does not hand us a clean archive of approved meanings. It hands us fragments, disputes, revisions, and voices that nearly disappeared. To read them is to enter a relationship not just with ideas, but with all the fragile acts of preservation that made reading possible. And maybe that is the deeper lesson. A dangerous book is never only the book. It is the evidence that human beings, even in fearful times, have continued to save what they did not fully understand, trusting that the future might read it more gently than the present could. And so we arrive at the strange threshold where all dangerous books eventually lead, not to certainty, but to self-examination. After legends, prohibitions, rediscoveries, and whispered warnings, what remains is a human pattern older than any single manuscript. We create text to preserve meaning, then fear what those meanings might do once released into the world. We hide books to protect society from them, and sometimes to protect them from society. We condemn certain pages as harmful, only to return generations later and find, within the same lines, not corruption, but longing, confusion, brilliance, grief, or an unfinished search for truth. This is why the history of forbidden books feels so intimate. It is not merely about censorship, religion, magic, science, or literature. It is about the recurring difficulty of being human in the presence of difficult knowledge. Some truths unsettle institutions, others unsettle the private self. A book may challenge what a culture teaches, or quietly expose what a reader has spent years trying not to name. In either case, the disturbance is real. But disturbance is not always destruction. Sometimes it is the beginning of moral clarity. To read responsibly is not to accept every claim a text makes. It is to remain awake inside the encounter, to ask who wrote it, why it endured, what fears gathered around it, and what needs or wounds it addressed in its own time. A mature reader does not worship the forbidden simply because it was banned, but neither do they dismiss it for having once caused alarm. They understand that fear is historical. It belongs to circumstances, hierarchies, anxieties, and eras. Perhaps that is the final paradox before our journey closes. The books once called dangerous often survive not because they held ultimate answers, but because they kept certain questions alive. Questions about authority, memory, transformation, suffering, desire, belief, and the cost of silence. And when a question survives long enough, it stops belonging to the past. It becomes a companion to the present, waiting for us to decide whether we are brave enough to read not just the page, but ourselves within it. In the end, perhaps the most dangerous thing about a book is not what it says, but what it asks of us. Across centuries, the manuscripts and banned works in this journey have worn many faces. Some were enormous and adorned, others cryptic and unreadable. Some promised transformation, some preserved forgotten histories. Some described the hidden chambers of the mind. Others simply told the truth too clearly or invited empathy where society preferred distance. Different ages feared them for different reasons, yet a single thread runs through them all. Each book disrupted the comfort of a settled story. That is why these texts continue to matter. Not because they confirm every legend attached to them, and not because the forbidden is automatically wise. They matter because they reveal how often humanity has confused unfamiliarity with danger. We recoil from what unsettles our categories. We build walls around mystery. We censor what forces us to confront suffering, contradiction, or the limits of our own understanding. And still, the page remains, waiting. There is something deeply hopeful in that endurance. A book can be burned, hidden, mocked, exiled, mistranslated, or misunderstood, yet still survive long enough to meet a new century with fresh eyes. In that sense, every rescued manuscript is more than an artifact. It is a conversation resumed, a reminder that knowledge is rarely pure, simple, or final. It arrives through fragments, through argument, through preservation by imperfect people who sense that even troubled truths deserve not to vanish. So perhaps the real lesson of dangerous books is neither fear nor fascination, but humility. We inherit a world shaped by voices we once tried to silence. We read under the protection of those who chose not to destroy what they did not fully trust. And in turning these pages, we are asked to do something difficult and beautiful, to remain open without surrendering judgment, to be skeptical without becoming closed, to let mystery deepen thought rather than end it. Because the future, like the past, will be shaped by what we choose to keep, what we dare to read, and what truths we allow to remain alive long enough to change us.